Honorable Minister of Education and Human Resource Development, the Honorable Ronald Jones, Chief Education Officer Acting, Mr. Laurie King, Deputy Chief Education Officer, Mr. Joy Giddings, Permanent Secretaries, members of the Board of Management, staff, students, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. I consider it an honor to be invited to deliver this Parkinson Memorial Lecture entitled Parkinson, Legend, Visionary, Administrator, and Educator Extraordinaire in look at early 20th century education. 50 years in the life of any institution and in a school is a critical juncture for reflection. It should be utilized as a time for reflection, for most likely that school would have seen many changes in administrators, changes in the caliber of students and pupils, changes in policy, changes in attitudes to work, and changes in staff. After 50 years, the school should have developed a culture, a distinct character, and ethos of its own. I attended Parkinson Comprehensive School, as it was called then, between 1969 and 1975. And I have very fond memories of my peers and my teachers. I want to recognize who I had a small sat together as a class. And I also want to recognize some of my teachers I saw here tonight. Mr. Chase, Mr. Eugene Pilgrim, who was just here, Mr. Victor Hutchinson at the back, and Mr. Lloyd Giddings, who taught me Spanish in the second form. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I don't see Mr. Clarkson Brewster here, but I admire Clarkson Brewster and Pearson Lackman quite a lot. I also want to recognize here as well that some have passed on, like Mr. Ernest Weir. I was dead scared of him. Herman Elby husband, Mr. Reese, Mr. Boeing, and Ding Ding himself. I hope that this education survive for another 500 years and continue to live up to its motto of onward, ever upward. Parkinson School first received pupils under the name of Pine Secondary Modern School on Monday, September 12, 1960. In less than a year, on the 22nd of February 1961, the official opening ceremony took place when the Minister of Education, Thorne, gave it the name Parkinson Secondary Modern School. This ceremony, attended by the Premier, Dr. Hugh Cummings, remember it's 1961, Brantley Adams is in the federal headquarters in Trinidad and Tobago, and Dr. Cummings is the Premier. So Dr. Cummings is at the ceremony, the Bishop of Barbados, the Governor Sir John Stewart, and they all heard Mr. Thorne in his speech spoke glowingly of the pioneer work and achievements of an educator, Augustus Parkinson. But before I get down to the critique of Mr. Parkinson, we have to find out a number of things. Who was this Augustus Parkinson? He was born in 1865 in St. John and died in 1932. His life, in essence, straddled the late 19th century and the early 20th century. The 19th century is referred to as the century of freedom, for it was during this century that all the slave systems of the major imperial powers were dismantled. The British West Indies in 1838, and you have France in 1848, Puerto Rico in 1872, USA in 1863, Cuba in 1886, and Brazil in 1888. It is important to understand these dates and the dismantlement of slave systems because the former enslaved people then had a problem of defining their own freedom. They wanted freedom, they had perceptions of freedom, but their former slave owners had perceptions of keeping them in bondage. So that tussle is going to be very important to understanding Parkinson tonight, what happened in the West Indies, and when they go to the United States in 1912 to understand what happened at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. The 20th century is called the American century because by 1914, the USA was producing 30% of the world manufactured goods. And by 1930, over 35%. Throughout the 20th century, the United States became a military, financial, and industrial giant. In short, the point I'm making is that Robert Parkinson lived in a very interesting era. In 1882, he entered the Royal Training Institute at Codrington College. The Royal Training Institute was the forerunner to Earlston Teachers College, which was established in 1947 and accepted students around 1948. But from the 1880s up to 1940s, the major institution for teacher training was at Codrington College, what is then called the Mission House. So in 1884, at the tender age, 19, he was appointed the headmaster of the Wesleyan Methodist Boys' School, known as the Hurd Institute in James Street. Between 1908 and 1926, he was the headmaster of Wesley Hall Boys' School, and it is there that he became famous as an administrator and a visionary leader in elementary education in Barbados. In 1912, while Parkinson formed part of a three-member delegation that attended the conference of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in the United States. This visit had a tremendous impact on Parkinson's work at Wesley Hall and subsequently influenced the teaching of what we call today technical and applicational education, domestic science and woodwork and metalwork, crafts, gardening. Booker T. Washington called it industrial education. In 1921, he was granted leave again to represent the island at the West Indian Education Conference held in Trinidad. In 1926, while Parkinson left Wesley Hall to take up the lectureship position at the Royal Training Institute at Codrington College. It helped force him into retirement in 1931, and he died on January 31st, 1932. That is a quick synopsis of the man we are speaking about. In order to appreciate the impact of Parkinson on the education system in Barbados, we must understand the nature of the system itself. I will confine my analysis to the primary level, referred to then as the elementary educational system. And it relates to the title of this lecture, says early 20th century. Robert Parkinson started his education sojourn in the late 19th century, so it's a straddle from one century to the next. However, I will stick to the 20th century. The educational system was presided over by an educational board. There was no Ministry of Education. It was run by a board. And was made up of the most conservative elements of the merchant plant elite, who never perceived mass education, as necessary, or that education should play a part in national development, or further, that it could facilitate social mobility or act as a social escalator. They believed that the mere rulers of education were the only thing that the black masses should aspire to. One member of the education board, in a similar fashion to a colleague in British Guyana, suggested that the only knowledge Black Barbadians should aspire to is the knowledge of the fork and the hoe. A member of the Assembly once remarked that the money spent on the police was money better spent than that on education. In 1932, the House of Assembly reviewed the local education system, and they concluded that it was producing too many scholars, and that expenditure on education was too high. Now, these white assemblymen always argued about the inability of the state to fund mass education, and that it would create what they call a recurrent expenditure which would follow. They were making such claims at a time when illiteracy was rampant. Thousands of poor illiterate children worked daily in the cane fields and river gangs. Stanley Clifford Thorne, I think I've got a lot to say about him tonight. You keep, remember that name, Stanley Clifford Thorne. Remarked in the assembly on one occasion, I am not a small man person, said. Meaning, of course, as a rule, the poor got no consideration from him. Schools in Barbados were governed by the regulations of the Education Board. And I want to go directly to the regulations of the Education Board in 1902. And I read some of these regulations, and you will see the sort of schools at the elementary level that were created. A. These are regulations. If you want to establish a school, you follow these regulations. A. That the school is necessary in the district. B. That the school premises are healthy, well ventilated, properly furnished and supplied with suitable offices, and contain sufficient accommodation for the scholars attending the school. C. That it is taught by a person approved by the board. Married women will not be regarded as suitable persons to be teachers, except under special circumstances. Discrimination against women. D. That the teachers are not allowed to undertake duties not connected with the school, which occupy any part whatever of the school hours. E. That the school and school books be at all times open to the inspection of the Education Board or any member thereof, and to any or either of its officers. F. That the chairman of managers, this is the person who is heading the Education Board, visit the school 4 times at least during each quarter. G. That neither work be taught in all board schools. In 1911, to give you some idea of the number of schools, there were 63 combined schools, 61 girls combined schools, 5 mixed combined schools, 34 infant schools, and 4 ragged schools, making a total of 167. The total, 133 were supervised by ministers in the Anglican Church, 16 by Moravian ministers, and 18 by Wesleyan ministers to education in that period in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Was education run in the church, the Anglican Church running the majority of schools. The state doesn't have a hand yet in education. That is going to come later. The total number of pupils registered during this early period was 28,371. So at the primary level, there were a number of, the number was around 30,000. However, thousands more under the age of 14 who should have been in school upset themselves because education was not compulsory. That is very important as well. In this period, it wasn't compulsory to go to school. They were forced to. Furthermore, many were too poor to pay the required school fees of 2 cents a week. Instead of attending school, thousands of children were found daily in child labor gangs and their estates. Hence, you get a good idea now why many people of our grandparents' generation were so illiterate. The reason. The curriculum in the elementary schools was made up largely of reading, dictation, arithmetic, religious instruction, needle work, drawing, and the education board said agricultural instruction. So much for the elementary school system. Now, the period 1880 to 1930 covered most of the working life of Lord Parkinson. The Barbados Times of July 2nd, 1884 referred to an opening ceremony for a new Wesleyan school room opposite the James Street Wesleyan Chapel. I want to quote from the Barbados Times. It says, the building, which had long been in contemplation, is now completed and will open tomorrow morning to receive pupils. Mr. Parkinson, a pupil from the training school at Parkinson College, where he is highly recommended, has been engaged to conduct the school. The attendance was very large, notwithstanding the threatening aspects of the weather. The little building, which is an ornament to our city, was full inside and out. That school was known as the Herd Memorial School, run by the Methodist Church, and later moved from James Street to Tudor Street, and then to its present residence in King Street around 1937, 1938. I was a little confused because some of the records say 1937, some say 1938. All evidence suggests that Lord Parkinson provided some leadership. He was visible around the school. He took an active part in classroom instruction. He was a man of stature, a good instructional leader, and a man of exceptional abilities. He felt that a balanced education was needed for all his pupils. Lord Parkinson labored for 42 years as headmaster of the school. As previously stated, Parkinson made his name as an administrator and a pioneer in education. In 1912, he formed part of the delegation to Tuskegee Institute, Alabama. Now, an entry, I want to refer to an entry in the minutes of the Education Board of Monday, 18th of March, 1912. This is what the minutes of that board said. A letter from the Reverend S.M. Hawthorne was read, asking that the leave of absence granted by the manager and himself to Mr. A.R. Parkinson, master of Wesley Hall Boys School, to enable him to attend the conference at Tuskegee convened by Dr. Washington to confirm. Mr. Hawthorne also asked, under the circumstances, the board would pay Mr. Parkinson an honorarium and allow him to draw full pay with a leave. The leave granted to Mr. Parkinson, the leave granted to Mr. Parkinson was approved, but Mr. Hawthorne was to be informed that the board had no power to grant him for that request with respect to the payment of Mr. Parkinson's honorarium. On the recommendation of the acting inspector of schools, Mr. Parkinson was granted a first-class certificate. So Augustus Lord Parkinson set off in 1912 for Alabama, USA. He's going to the Tuskegee Institute, but we must also put this whole thing about the Washington Tuskegee Institute into perspective so that we really understand his impact and thinking that occurred at the particular time. Who was this Booker T. Washington? And what kind of program existed at the Tuskegee Institute which attracted so much attention? Booker T. born slave parents in 1856. Booker T. Washington worked his way through school in 1881 founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a vocational school for blacks, and he remained head of the institute until his death in 1915. There he developed the philosophy that blacks' best hope for assimilation lay in at least temporarily accommodating to whites. Rather than fighting for political rights, the Petit said blacks should work hard, acquire property, and prove that they were worthy of white rights. The circumstances in which blacks found themselves, their education, he insisted should be mainly vocational and practical. Washington voiced his views in the widely acclaimed speech at the Atlanta Exposition in 1895. Dignify and glorify common labor, he urged his listeners in what became known as the Atlanta Compromise. Agitation of questions of racial equality is the extremist folly, he argued. Envisioning a society where blacks and whites in the West would remain apart but share the same goals. Washington observed that, and I quote, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all matters essential to mutual progress. Now, before I go on, I need to talk about the struggle for freedom in the United States in order for me to understand why the Booker T. Washington had such an impact, why he attracted so many critics in the United States. Now, you hear me constantly talk about the South and the Southern states. When I say Southern states, if you know the map of the United States, I mean Louisiana, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, that area. It is in the southern states that slavery existed, and that where the vast majority of black people in the United States until 1940 lived. There were about 6 million blacks in the United States. In 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, fought between the northern states and the southern states of Confederacy. They broke away. There was a civil war. The North defeated the South in that conflict. And then they embarked, this war ended in 1863. But in the midst of the Civil War in 1863, Abraham Lincoln freed 6 million slaves. 186,000 or so made their way to the North and fought in the Union Army. The Union Army in the North, the Confederacy in the South. Some stayed behind and fought with their former slave owners in the Confederacy Army. Others abandoned the plantations and they went all over the place. They tried to make their way to the North, seeking freedom, Canada and other places. So at the end of the Civil War, there was considerable confusion in the South. And they embarked in the United States something called Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a very interesting concept. They had 3 major things to settle in Reconstruction. Reconstruction, in a sense, in a physical sense, to rebuild the infrastructure. Now, during the Civil War, all the fighting took place in the southern states, not in the north. So all the towns and plantations, the whole infrastructure was destroyed. So Reconstruction meant to rebuild the South in a physical sense. The second aspect of Reconstruction that had been settled in this period was to determine the terms and conditions under which the southern states would be admitted back into the Union. The third aspect that I'm interested in, it was to determine the fate of the former enslaved blacks. This is where Booker T. Washington came. Now, the blacks who were liberated had notions of freedom. As a matter of fact, there was a famous saying that they wanted 40 acres and a mule. That is their concept. That freedom had to mean something. But like in the West Indies, even though emancipation came in the form of legislation, it meant something different in terms of civic rights and freedom. So in the United States, blacks were abandoned by Reconstruction in 1877 in terms of the United States pulling out and leaving them at the mercy of the old planter class in the South and the white supremacists. It is in this period that they got what is called the Black Codes, the Jim Crow laws that we hear so much about. The Jim Crow laws were the laws that were passed against discriminating against blacks on trains and in restaurants and such, like kind of social apartheid. They got the Ku Klux Klan, you know about lynching, segregation, racial discrimination, and institutionalized racism. That was the face of the blacks in the late 19th century, and even better into the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. Then the civil rights movement went into the South. They were appalled. They could not believe that conditions of blacks in the South were so horrible. There were many Netherlands who weren't aware that conditions had almost remained like they were in the 19th century. So you had to determine how blacks would fare in this new order. And that is why Booker T. Washington proposed this idea of separate but equal, that blacks could live along, they must adopt an industrial education, and not to challenge white supremacy for rights. Of course, you know that people like W. E. Du Bois, James Trotter criticized Booker T as a sellout. They argued that he wanted to create second-class citizens of blacks, and that he gave up on the question the acquisition of civic rights for the African American population in the South. Now, that is the situation that Booker T. Washington had to deal with, and that is why he took this position. I'm going to say some more on Booker T as I go along, and as I bring it right back to Barbados. But more specifically on the idea of education, what Booker T said in the Atlanta Compromise had a lot to do with the acquisition of civic rights. But he made specific statements about education. And it is worth hearing directly from Booker T. Washington, who, speaking at a meeting of the National Educational Association in Madison, Wisconsin in 1884, he expounded on the idea of the kind of education he thought would be most fitting for black Americans. I am going to quote from Booker T, and I'm going to leave you to pass your judgment for yourself as to what you think he meant and what he intended. I read up from slavery as a boy at primary school, and as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that Booker T ever said that blacks were inferior to whites. He had a strategy. It is my understanding that some documents have been found, this is personal papers, and that Booker T was up to all sorts of tricks. He recognized, he said that we should not pull a lion tail. He recognized white supremacy and what it meant, and he intended to get around in that way. So listen to Booker T. He's speaking on education. He says, any movement for the elevation of the Southern Negro, in order to be successful, must have to a certain extent the cooperation of Southern whites. They control government, own property. Whatever benefits the black man benefits the white man. The proper education of all whites will benefit the Negro as much as the education of the Negro will benefit the whites. Brains, property, and character for the Negro will settle the question of civil rights. The best course to pursue in regard to the civil rights bill in the South is to let it alone. Let it alone, and it will settle itself. A certain class of whites in the South object to the general education of the colored man on the grounds that when he is educated, he ceases to do manual labor. And they are evading the fact that much aid is withheld from Negro education in the South by the states on these grounds. Just here, the great mission of industrial education, coupled with the mental, comes in. It kills two birds with one stone. It secures the cooperation of the whites and does the best possible thing for the black man. Whites in the South and Northern philanthropists such as Rockefeller and Carnegie welcomed Washington's accommodationist policy because it urged patience and it reminded black people to stay in their place. Because he said what they wanted to hear, white business people, reformers, and politicians chose to regard Washington as representative of all African Americans. That is what is important. Booker T. Washington, however, never argued that blacks were inferior to whites. He asserted that they could enhance their dignity through self-improvement. He advocated what he called industrial education. Parkinson was impressed with what he saw at Tuskegee and vowed to apply it to Barbados on his return. I must state here that I am not suggesting that Lord Parkinson shared Booker T. Washington's outlook on race relations and then tried to create a carbon copy of his curriculum for Barbados with the intention of using vocational education to put blacks in their place. He was merely impressed with the curriculum at Tuskegee. On returning to Barbados, he organized classes in crafts such as basketry, broom and brush making, printing, shoemaking, and carpentry, as well as he had a love for music and what he called moral education. And this was done on a scale unmatched by other elementary schools. In addition, a kitchen was established so that hot meals could be provided for the children. Parkinson's work received the blessings of the Reverend Gerald Nichols, the inspector of schools, who urged that industrial training be introduced in the island's elementary schools. Another educator, H.N. Grehart, also gave Parkinson considerable support and assisted with the introduction of this type of education among the elementary schools. Reverend A.H. Ansett, principal of Cottington College, introduced the idea of a training manual among the training teachers at the Law Institute. Lord Parkinson was known to be a devout Methodist, a spiritual man who was very concerned with the needs and aspirations of others. His pioneer work in providing hot meals attests to his humanitarian instincts. But this side of him was revealed again in 1923 when he attracted the abuse of some plantation owners. On the 12th of March 1923, a debate occurred in the local assembly which focused on the expenditure for elementary education in the island. This debate, for me, exposed the vicious nature of elements of commercial planting elite. Stanley Clifford Thorne, a prominent planter and representative for St. Thomas, led off the discussion in the most negative and aggressive way. I want to quote from speeches of this debate. Stanley Clifford Thorne. It is a fact that the board is spending £41,000 of public money, and we are not getting 41,000 cents in benefit of it. We will go on until our teeth fall out, and we will never get results. I asked the teacher, if anybody passes your school, what happens? He said, the children will turn around and curse you and revile you. There must be something wrong with the system of education that permits a child to go into a public thoroughfare and curse the first person he meets. Perhaps he simply does it in exuberance of spirits, but it is my opinion that the whole thing is rotten from the education board down. And unless some steps, and this is my emphasis, unless some steps are taken to improve the system and improve administration, we are only wasting 40,000 pounds every year. That is the contribution of Mr. Tom. Such a posture is characteristic of Stanley Clifford Tom. Whenever there is any consideration of expenditure for the upliftment of the masses, on every occasion, he resorts to the most trivial rhetoric of the measure. He suggests this step should be taken to improve elementary system of education, yet time after time he offered none. Even when he proceeded to the legislative council, I have read numerous debates in which S.C. Thorne were involved, and other legislators will never disagree with him, but voted session after session with him. So I am left to conclude that they agree with him. Thorne, many members of the ruling oligarchy never cared about the welfare of black masses and were content to use their control of the purse strings to keep black barbarians uneducated and ignorant. In the same debate, Dr. N.L. Boxer, representative for St. George, John Defray, launching a direct attack on Ron Parkinson. I will let Dr. Boxer speak for himself. Listen to Dr. Boxer. There's no doubt that something is wrong with the education system of Barbados. But there is that the difficulty is to find out where the fault is. The aim of an education system is to turn out citizens. People we are turning out today are not the citizens in the sense their parents were. You hear this today? The honorable member says the education board are very respected. When you say that, there's a lot of laughter in the house. Perhaps it would be a good idea to give them 5 guineas a meeting. Is it Mr. Nichols? And he's referring to the inspector of schools. He has no power to change the system. Is it the children? Or is it the spirit of unrest in the world today? Is it the masters? Do we want a better set of masters? I remember at a meeting held a short time ago, we had a leading school master who is teaching the youth of this country, saying that it is the planters who are setting fire to the kings. Is it likely to raise better citizens with a man of that sort who is teaching the young? Man, you are Parkinson. Again, I must stress that Dr. Boxer's contribution to this debate was so common of the merchant plant elite when they perceived the interest was threatened. I want you sitting there to come and go on with me on an imaginary journey. I want you to use what we call historical imagination. Imagine the period of the late 19th century, the early 20th century, say around 1890 to 1950. When this entire island is covered in sugarcane, even in the area where Earlston College is located today. Can you imagine that? As far as Carrington Village, this island is covered. I want you to do again with me. Imagine all the area of Bank Hall, Q, all that area covered in sugarcane. Amber Division. Imagine the area of the Bayland, as far as the government headquarters, planted in sugarcane. That is what Barbados is doing. Short, during this period, the sugarcane could be found growing on the outskirts of Rochelle. Such was the pervasive nature of the plantation system. It dominated the physical landscape, and by virtue of its hegemonic influence, the plantocracy dominated the political and social order. Now, during the early 1920s, now you got the idea of the pervasive nature of the plantation system, because they could have gone into St. James and all the way to Sandy Lane, the Keynes. In 1919, they saw in the Fort Chancery records, Sandy Lane was a worthless estate. Nobody wanted to buy Sandy Lane. But the land cost $1 million and $2 million now. Show you how things change with time. And the plantation system would have been almost down to the coast in Oyster. So the plantation covered right now. But this is the critical point here where they're getting at Parkinson. During the early 1920s, there was spade came as far as engulfed the island. And the colonial governor, a man called Charles O'Brien, wrote to his superiors complaining about widespread lawlessness in the island and about hotheads in the UNIA threatening planters. He argued that the situation must be monitored closely because black Barbadians were lazy, easily excitable, and use his words, and can be led astray by idle thought perpetrated by agitators. The planters joined the governor in arguing that became first were started by what they referred to as the lawless hooligan elements of the city, even suggesting school children were involved. Parkinson, on one occasion, defended the teaching fraternity in his voice. At the meeting, he argued that he instilled values of discipline and hard work in his pupils, and short of concrete evidence, he cannot allow anyone to place the blame for the fires on the pupils of the elementary school. He suggested it may be the planters themselves who telling us they were furious that an elementary school teacher can even make such a suggestion about the local plantocracy. We have heard school teachers related like that before. But there's another aspect to this saga that must be told. It is that the conservative self-interest and the master-servant relationship of early 20th century plantation society worked to ensure that the masses were kept in their place, poverty was perpetuated. Every time members of the merchant planter addressed the need to improve the standard of education on the island, out of their mouths emerged empty racist diatribe and innuendos. They lacked the courage to enunciate a vision for education. In fact, I would argue that they lack a vision for the future of education. And perhaps that explains why they were so sterile in the debates. They had no concept of the use of education as an investment in human and social capital to uplift communities and create wealth. And further, this ruling had no plan how they could use education to foster nation building, nationhood, or national development. Woody Blackman was quite right when he critiqued what they saw Augustus Ward Parkinson, critiqued why they saw Augustus Ward Parkinson as such a negative way. He wrote, and I quote, "When therefore here Ward Parkinson introduced a new philosophy into the business of teaching children and providing avenues for achieving excellence, he became the target of abuse by some plantation owners who saw Parkinson's philosophy of education as a threat to their material level and social well-being." Clement Lisbon Nickham, famous journalist, activist, and social reformer, also came to the rescue of Lord Parkinson on this occasion. Now, before I proceed to deal with what Clement Wickham had to say about this incident, Parkinson,